First of all, things important that came up yesterday that we missed on this list, points that you think were not accurately captured, or things that were not clear.
While people are thinking about that, I want to just raise one other issue. I guess some of you yesterday had other specific suggestions around studies or research questions where real-world evidence might be relevant. And yesterday's discussions focused on some particular case examples to bring these issues to life, because context does matter for the questions. FDA would very much like to hear from people about questions where there are important issues that are not being addressed or haven't effectively been addressed without reliance on real-world evidence. We would too, I think, as we refine all of these points that have been made into hopefully something that resembles more of a framework or a path forward for assessing the appropriateness of use of real-world evidence approaches. These additional questions could be helpful in again, bringing those to life. So there's a web address that we're putting up here. We'll also make it available after the meeting, where we would like to hear from you about specific study questions and hopefully more opportunities to apply the kind of issues we're discussing today and any kind of framework or further steps that come out of that. I think it is important to stay grounded in why we're doing this. I know it's challenging, but there are some important issues out there where either we don't have as much evidence as we'd like, or it's been very difficult to develop that evidence through traditional approaches. Not necessarily saying that this is better, but that's what we're trying to get at through the meeting.
So now that you had a few moments to think, what things are missing from the list, which things are not accurate? Oh, you want to push the button so people can hear you.
Good morning. Mark Wine from the VA Central Office. I'd like to suggest the point that with the rapid consumer-driven, patient evidence-based healthcare environment evolving, we need to take a look at and consider the Internet of Things and how medical devices, medical products, are going to be are becoming interfaces with the human patient, with the consumer, in order to accurately and validly identify diagnoses and communicate about treatments. So I'd just like to suggest an address to medical devices, patient or consumer-driven Internet of Things.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that I'm realizing now, I think there were, when we looked at the notes this morning, I think that was on there, but probably in the wrong place, because I think it may be there in some notes in the real world treatment section, but this is, I think you're right, this is where it belongs. And now recollecting some of the discussion we had yesterday, I think one of the key points is those data are sort of, potentially remarkably valuable, and very rich, but also sometimes quite chaotic. So how it is we're going to interpret that, that the data stream is much more complex than the kind of data that we're used to getting. As opposed to a single ICD-10 code, we could have 28 days of continuously recorded activity monitoring and hours of sleep. So it's not a simple thing.
Yes, hi, good morning. Gracie Lieberman from Genentech. I think it's almost captured here, but when I think about, the data, the end of the data that ISD sort of, like we'd say, consumer of it would want is, what were the data sources that contribute, and what was the procedure to extract the data? And sort of, can there be transparencies about both of what are the sources and how the quality of these sources is judged in general, of their completeness, of their accuracy, of how they captured diagnosis and others, and then how sort of reliable and consistent are the processes that extract the data. So how much do they depend on just the sort of language processing versus sort of looking at comparing 4 or 5 different physicians' notes to come up with one answer? So knowing the sort of transparency of these procedures would be helpful.
I think more emphasis on the transparency and the reproducibility question, and I think we talked about that yesterday, both in terms of are other people able to access this data source and reproduce the work, or do other people have free access to all the transformations that happen between the source data and the analytic data set? And at least, personally for me, I'd make a strong case that I think, for credibility, that's absolutely foundational. If your code's not on GitHub where I can look at it, then I really just have no confidence at all in your findings.
On that same note, the whole field.
I'll go ahead and say who you are.
I'm sorry. Hi, Sheila Weiss. I'm at Avidera, senior research leader and a longtime pharmacoepidemiologist. And one of the things that the whole field of clinical trials has evolved, and the standards for this very purpose, right? And now the type of data and the transfer of files, and this has come up more and more. For example, in rare diseases. So when you are going up and you have, for example, the ability to use historic controls, observational or now real-world data, what are the data standards? Do they have to be collected with the same rigor and the same standard forms, and as you would as if they were a comparative group in a clinical trial? So these kind of questions clients have right now, and really need to know. What are the standards for the data and for the whole trail? So that's a big question.
So one thing that didn't come up yesterday as we were talking about, Jennifer Graff, National Pharmaceutical Council. So one of the things that didn't come up yesterday as we were talking about systemic biases is how reimbursement can help provide an incentive or a nudge for patients to choose one treatment versus another. So as we think about the use cases that we had yesterday, additional indications, safety, the determination on whether something's on a tier 2 versus tier 4 or some type of copay typically has some nudge, maybe not the extent that we hope, to what treatments patients actually have. And so thinking not only about the health system systemic biases, but also the payment systemic biases as well.
Thanks. Some of that, I won't ring the bell, but some of that I think is we're going to push to the session 3. But I think the general point, I think, is recognizing that out in real-world health systems, there are significant financial incentives that bear on providers and patients that affect their behavior. That in the data area, I think, as we gave some examples yesterday, there may be incentives to health systems and even individual providers about coding certain diagnoses that can have big impact, it's very important to be aware of those. And then you're saying on the treatment, as we say, channeling or potential confounding by indication or other biased treatment assignment. The fact that one treatment may be less expensive will mean some people are more likely to get it. Good.
Hi, Elise Berliner from ARC. So there is something related to the payers, though, that I think does go here, which is, in general, who are the other stakeholders who are using this data and have a need for data? And so this conversation is very much about industry and FDA, but payers, as they develop value-based purchasing, they need data. Medicare and payers also are trying to measure the quality of care. The PCPI, the Physicians Consortium for Performance Improvement, they are putting in a huge effort into data infrastructure. So at ARC, we kind of talk about, collect data once, use for many purposes. So who are all the people who need data? And I would say the most important perspective, which is kind of missing here, is, fundamentally the healthcare system is about a patient and their provider. And so, like, when I read something like this, the data could also be biased based on incomplete ascertainment due to health system issues, fragmented data, and some events may be more likely to be outside a patient's usual health system. That is a problem for the patient and their provider trying to provide care for that patient. So how do we how do we work together with the other stakeholders to make the data infrastructure better, more reliable?
I think maybe the more general point, and this would be a question I hadn't thought of this clearly, but would be an important question to ask. If we think about the data needs of maybe the people mostly around this table, people who are interested in evaluating the effectiveness and safety of new or relatively new medical products and the kind of things that we need to know for that, are there any data needs there that are unique to these questions? Or are really all of these data needs completely universal in terms of, the individual clinical encounter, in terms of quality improvement in healthcare operations? I'm not sure there's anything unique here. If we use different terms. I mean, we talk about the exposure. If you're providing healthcare, you don't call it the exposure. You call it something else. Provider wouldn't typically say, "I'm about to expose you to something," or maybe put in other words, the idea that what we want to be able to very accurately assess what is people's health state before they get care, what exact care did they get, why did they get it, did it work or not, and did it hurt them? Those are all of those questions. You'd say, well, that's like what doctors and patients want to know. They just use different words for the same thing.
But just to add to this point too is that we focus here on a framework for describing, given the real world data that are out there, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses and issues to consider. I think to your point too, if part of this is also about recommendations for improving the quality or reliability of data, it's certainly the case that organizations or manufacturers that have, for reasons of payment or quality improvement, more support, more incentives for tracking patients longitudinally, for filling in those missing elements when people have traditionally gone outside of health systems, that kind of policy change outside of FDA issues can certainly create more support for the data needed for some FDA related regulatory decisions as well.
I mean, everybody is struggling for sustainability of how are they going to collect the data that they need to do their purpose. But if we sort of say we all have a collective need in data, can we put together our resources? Maybe we could really get a really good data infrastructure.
So I don't envy you of trying to come up with any guidance on data quality. What I'm thinking is, well, the universe is actually quite simple on a certain level. We have exposure, we have outcome, we have confounders to make things really simple, right? Rather than talking about quality of these measurements, let's be more specific. Outcomes we want to have measured with high specificity. We want to have a surveillance mechanism for the outcomes that is non-differential with regard to exposure. Let's agree on these things. I think we can all agree on these things, what makes good quality for the general purpose of assessing the effectiveness and safety of medical products, right? And then, based on that, we can say, look, what are the options out there? What is available to us? And then we come to the stage where we make the assessment. What is fit for this specific purpose? And this is where the transparency discussion comes in, where we need to understand exactly, can we now track back to these characteristics that we have set up out at the beginning, right? Does this measurement really fulfill the requirements that we set out, right? That's the transparency. And I want to point you again to this ISPI ISPOR consensus statement that was very detailed with regard to exactly these characteristics, what needs to be characterized in order to understand what the measurement was and what it will do. I would not go in these discussions about data standards and things. Standards are shifting. I'm in this business for quite a while now, and they've shifted a lot over time. And it doesn't really help that much. We know enough about what types of measurements and quality of measurement we need in order to get unbiased or less biased findings.
Putting together those last two comments, I think, what I'm hearing is all the stakeholders need to measure the same things, but not necessarily in the same way. If we're trying to measure some particular outcome for clinical purposes, for quality improvement purposes, for payment purposes, or for assessing, or comparing medical products, our definition of the exact way we would specify the definition of a myocardial infarction might be quite different. We might want much higher specificity for one purpose. We might want much higher sensitivity for another purpose. So I think to say now the quality of we all have a shared interest in the quality of the original data. We all want that to be as good as possible. The way we process that original data, the specs specifically that we apply to that, or the definition we apply to that, may be purpose specific. So our shared interest in the quality of the original data is the thing we need to emphasize. As I sometimes, jokingly say, I now work for a $90 billion a year company. So if I go to them and say, I could do a really important study and I could get a research grant for my Austin Powers imitation $1 million, they just don't care. But if I say, this is good for the company needs to do this because it is central to our business purpose, they would care about that. That company really doesn't care that much about the research. So anything about data quality needs to be framed aligned with the interest of the broader healthcare system and doctors and patients.
Yeah, I think that just to follow on Sebastian's comments, I'm concerned about the shift to real-world evidence, that we are lulled into thinking that the conclusions we make are the same as the structured studies. So if I want to look at a data field in a structured study, I've got a data dictionary, understand exactly what the ascertainment is, and we can be very satisfied with that. We have monitoring, we do all kinds of things to make sure the data is really good. I wonder if there's a simple fix, which is that any estimand that you create from the real world, you should at least do a couple things. One is define the ascertainment, and the other is define the range of responses and put that in there. And at least we would understand that. So if someone said, my mean blood pressure was 120, but my range was -30 to 5,000, that'd be important information for me to understand. And also, how much was missing? Because we know that missingness is never at random. So I think there's some simple things that we could do just to say, basically, you're making a conclusion on this. What was the missingness? And what were the range of responses? And maybe there's some other things we could do too as well, but they would help me a lot to understand how reliable a piece of data is by just a couple of those kind of factors.
I want to put that comment together with something else that came up yesterday that maybe wasn't accurately captured, which is, these days I think the original source data, say for a diagnosis that comes from an electronic health record, is not an ICD-10 code. That is often as deep as we go into the source data. The source data are actually clickstream data. And what I mean by that is, as a provider, when I am working in an electronic health record and a diagnosis appears in an encounter, a billing diagnosis appears in an encounter, I'll get a little, maybe way too into the weeds here. That diagnosis can actually be populated through very specific and different processes. It can be populated because I have reordered a medication to which that diagnosis was attached, and that diagnosis now automatically populates into this encounter. The other is I could type in an actual number if I know the number. I used to know ICD-9 numbers. I don't know ICD-10 numbers, so I rarely type a number anymore. But in the old days, I would sometimes type a number because it's faster. Or I would type words. And the words I type in most electronic health record systems, the words actually activate behind the scenes a search function which matches codes to words. And what we are taught, at least in the health system where I work, is for efficiency, if I'm about to enter a diagnosis, I should type the first 3 or 4 letters of each word. So if I am saying, I want to make a diagnosis of recurrent major depression of moderate severity, I would type rec maj dep mod. I would then be presented with a list of possible diagnoses, and I would pick one. Since I'm a very lazy person, I usually just pick the first one on the list. So this is all but what I'm saying is those are the data. All of those data are actually very practically accessible, but we never access them. This to me is a really interesting question because I suspect the meaning of a diagnosis of recurrent major depression of moderate severity that was repopulated from a medication reorder, that was typed in as a numerical code, that was typed in as these text strings or these text strings, are quite different things. And I know this is a long-winded, but I'm finally getting to my point here. What we talked about yesterday was the idea that the world is probabilistic, it is not deterministic. And that, if we really wanted to improve our accuracy, we would say that these clinical phenomena like a myocardial infarction, a thromboembolic stroke, a recurrence or relapse of major depression, would be assessed probabilistically using every single one of these data elements, the original, click streams, which and in most other industries, that's how people do things now. In most technologically sophisticated industries, people want to capture, they want to capture even latency of response, not just what you typed into the Google search box, but how fast you typed it, whether you backspaced, all that. Know it or not, they're using all of that stuff. We're not using all of that stuff. It would be a whole interesting new science to use all that stuff, and we probably need to get there.
Yeah. Sorry.
Or Bob then.
Well, you're all talking about something that I'm interested in. When people talk about using these data, they usually are thinking about cardiovascular outcomes because we're pretty sure that people collect those at least reasonably. I think it would be worth considering all of the other possible areas where we think the data might be good enough to use. You gave it as an example recurrent major depression. But there's probably lesser degrees of depression you might be interested in. Do those get recorded? And that's going to help people understand where these approaches might be potentially useful because the data are collected. And you don't hear much discussion of that. I don't know which endpoints are regularly put into these systems. Yeah. And it seems to me that's very critical to know how one might possibly use these things.
Yeah, so I'll get a little into the weeds here, but just when we talk about sort of what's the nature of the source data, for instance, if I were trying to assess the severity of depression in an electronic health record by a diagnostic code, because I deal with this, if there were a severity specifier of moderate that was actually entered at this encounter, I might believe it. If there were a severity specifier of moderate that were carried over from a medication that was originally ordered 9 months ago, I wouldn't believe it at all, because those two are completely different things. One is I actually assessed the patient and decided how severe their depression was and recorded it, and the other is that's how severe their depression was 9 months ago when I first ordered that medication. Yeah. But if all we're seeing is the ICD-10 code that comes out of there and we don't know how it entered the record, those two things...
Well, that's sort of the point. I mean, you're pretty sure that you can calculate how many strokes a person had, because maybe that gets into the record. I'm just not nearly sure about depression or worsening of a GI problem or anything like that. So if these approaches are usable only in a narrow set of diseases, we should know that. Doesn't mean that's a fatal defect, but we should know.
Andy Beinman from UCSF. I find this conversation very helpful as well. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking, Greg, is I was drawing a parallel with what I know with Medicaid systems like the one in California, where they get a tremendous amount of claims that come in of people who theoretically are Medicaid beneficiaries, but then they do a very active curating process to go and describe what is truly a certified Medicaid eligible person. And I was sort of thinking about that as a parallel to the clinical issues that you're bringing up, which is our data systems are going to remain messy for all the reasons that you describe, but could we develop and systematize the kinds of algorithms and have auditing to back up in some way the rules that are used to curate data in health systems, as an example, so that there are similar ways across different sites of saying what a certifiable depression patient is or a certifiable MI patient is and so forth, depending on these kinds of rules. Because if these rules are, even if they're, quote, transparent, if they're highly variable across different sites, we've got a problem on our hands because there will inevitably be tremendous variation around that. So figuring out how to go from the messiness and create sort of certifying rules to, and you're right, you could have a different sensitivity or specificity around that, but that curation, I think, has to happen at the level of which the messy data is coming in on the front end. And I don't believe that we could standardize or make the messy data part go away, because clinically what you described is exactly right, which is sometimes you're writing medication refills or all sorts of real-world things going on in clinical activity that are going to prevent that from happening. And so I think our task should partly be about trying to figure out how do we develop the algorithms or the systematic rules to create curatable data at a site that then is good enough to move on to the next level of being considered good enough for the purposes of research. And I think there are enough commonalities that could be figured out around how to do that. I mean, you were just listing off common sense things like, oh, obviously if I wrote that diagnosis on a diagnosis that shifts over time, I can't trust something from 10 months ago, or other ways that you could, in fact, feel like you had enough probabilistic ways of feeling confident around that, but not just at your particular site, but that could be tested across multiple sites.
Mark Wine, VA. I continually have a sense of the conversation on sites, endpoints of data, versus a learning health system, which is grounded. The learning health system is grounded in the recognition that many of the problems that cost lives and dollars can be seen as part of the symptoms themselves of an economy that drives opportunity, that delivers opportunity for some but not all. Data scientists, biomedical clinicians, the NIH arena. We need to think differently and consider the learning health system where the stakeholders learn, and they learn large, and they learn with delivered, personalized decision support that will help consumers, everybody, manufacturers, clinicians, researchers, in our daily lives. So I want to say that the way we can educate ourselves in a real-time way with real-time use of validated clinical research from as information as a service provider is to take a look and consider the 10 core principles of the learning health system.
Yeah, point well taken. I think, and very similar to, what we were hearing before is that, the primary goal of improving the information that's generated in healthcare is to deliver better healthcare. Although a lot of us care about research is the tail, it is not the dog. Healthcare is, actually improving people's health is the dog, and we are just the tail that rides along.
This is Jacqueline Corrigan-Cry from FDA. I mean, a lot of the discussion on data quality seems to always go back to just retrospective collection of the data, and so we haven't really captured the prospective. And for a pragmatic clinical trial in which you're using these data, but you probably have some control or what mechanism. So we also need to think about, and I guess it gets to sort of Bob's point, what has been done in the trial, if you do have the opportunity to be prospective, to address some of these missingness or other things, be that, little algorithms, be that other training, be that backup, I don't know, thinking of the Salford study, different things that they may have done to address, the deficits that aren't there, but still take advantage of all the data that is there. So it's just another aspect. I don't know if it fits quite, but.
No, and good point. And I know the Salford lung study, which some of you may know, and I can think of some other examples where studies that were done, prospective studies were done that were sort of embedded or built into the electronic health record, and what that allowed is including prompts in the electronic health record to improve the data collection. So to say, if you're prescribing this treatment, you need to answer these questions. If you need to administer this patient-reported outcome scale. So, and the electronic health records do allow you to make that happen at the point of care. There's another one.
Yes, Kathy Critchlow, Amgen. So we're all talking about quality, and I think we all think we know it when we see it. We're also talking about fit for purpose. But in my mind, it's, who is defining fit for purpose? Is each stakeholder defining fit for purpose? Are we trying to define or equate quality with fit for purpose? And if so, like to Bob's point, cardiovascular outcomes might be measured more accurately, depression maybe not. Are we trying to decide how do we raise the bar for all of the things out there that are not measured as accurately or specifically as we would like? Or just what is the arena that we're really trying to button down here?
I'm thinking about your comment and Sebastian's comment earlier, and going back to, and I'm thinking how we capture this idea that, different stakeholders, I think, will use the same source data, and all stakeholders are interested in the highest quality of the source data, but to different purposes. So, for instance, an area I deal in a lot, exposure to antidepressant drugs. If in a health system we may care about that because it has to do with treatment adherence, and we may put in place, as we have quality improvement systems, to identify people who appear to have stopped taking their medicine. There are HEDIS measures for that. HEDIS has its criteria, for better or worse. They are what they are, and that is a purpose for quality measurement. If we're interested in looking at safety issues related to antidepressant medication, we will use the same source data, which are basically, prescription fill date, number of pills dispensed, days supply, instructions, to compute other measures of exposure. My measure of exposure for a safety question, my measure of exposure for an effectiveness question, HEDIS's measure of exposure for a quality improvement question, or the health system's measure of exposure for clinical purposes might be calculated all different ways. We certainly, though, want the most accurate and transparent, information about the source data. So the fit for purpose does depend on the purpose, but and I think we want transparency about that, and there may be times when we're interested in a tighter definition of exposure and a looser definition of exposure, and we need to justify that. But the more we can go, I guess the case I'm making is, what I don't want, or for my purposes, is I would not want an already processed exposure measure that tells me this person was exposed or not. I want the source. And I want to know, if you defined exposure this way, show me your code. I need to be able to see your code. I need to be able to modify your code if I want a tighter or looser definition. So it's that, that transparency all the way back to the original source, to me, that's the really critical thing.
My name is John Birch, and I'm an angel investor with the Mid-America Angels in Kansas City. And I'm here because I'm just understanding what's going on in this whole space, and I have some observations about the sources of health and medical data that I think I touched on briefly yesterday, but I'd just like to amplify a little bit, if that's okay. And it has to do with the trend toward personal health records. And PHRs are indeed an industry. And Google Health and others tried it 10 years ago and failed spectacularly for a number of reasons.
I still have an account in every one of those things, and they're all empty.
I can give you the names of about 60 companies that are doing something very similar to that today. Most of you here are probably familiar with Hugo, but Nosh, Picnic, Patient Bank, IntakeMe, Willow Glade, Smart PHR, and Hugo. There's 60 of them easily that I know of. I could reel them. I'm probably off by a factor of 10, so my guessing is there's 600 to 1,000. The technology barriers are not nearly what they were 10 years ago, but none of these businesses, in my view, is really sustainable because the economic model it's just not there. So I just want to say that, and I might just quickly throw out, Mark, you were asking for suggestions of maybe a research project. I think the FDA would do well to study what's going on in the PHR business, so to speak, because there are some best practices, and they really do meet patient needs and doctors' needs to some extent. Whether they meet the data needs farther downstream is really the critical question. And that's really what I want to get to as my second point. Bernard and I were just talking earlier about the this phrase that we often hear that data is the new oil, that everyone can make money somehow or other from data. But so far, the people who are left out of that are patients. They're not making any money from their data, and yet they perhaps could if it were managed in a certain way. But what I really want to get to is the question of data quality. One of the astonishing things to me as an outsider, just sort of looking at this, somewhere along the line I learned the definition of a medical device, and then I realized I was told that electronic medical records are not medical devices. And yet if there is a technology that meets the definition of medical device to a T, it's electronic medical records, providing information that is used for medical decisions. So we're talking about, I guess to use the oil analogy, what's missing from a lot of the discussions is the oil refinery. We have crude oil in the ground, and how do we refine it into something that is fit for secondary purposes? Sebastian had this great slide yesterday that used sort of primary purpose and secondary purpose of transactional data. And I would like to suggest that in the long run, and it probably won't be too many more years, secondary uses will predominate economically and in other ways, however you want to sort of measure that. What I mean by that is that the use of data on a given patient by that patient's doctor will be secondary, will be a subset of the superset of uses that are needed for regulatory decisions, for medical product decisions, for studying natural history of disease, for all kinds of research purposes that are simply impossible nowadays. I don't know whether there are any pediatricians in the room, but one of the interesting things I've had a chance to learn about in the last couple of years is the fetal origins of adult disease. A great frustration, I believe, for pediatricians is that when kids age out of pediatrics, even if their data were well collected up to that point, it's totally lost to their adult physicians. If we had some way of keeping personal health records, if that industry could become viable, that problem would be solved. Similarly, the other major sort of disjuncture in healthcare longitudinally is, of course, when we all turn 65. It's of no interest for payers to have done good preventative kind of stuff when we're in our 50s or early 60s because they know they lose it all. No, they're not going to pay for it or benefit from that once we turn 65. It's all up to the government. Those are policy issues. That one is a policy issue, and it really should be addressed. And I don't think 21st Century Cures touched it. But I guess what I'm really getting at, to try to wrap up, because I could go on, is that I think data quality is a bigger problem than people realize, and yet it is like, to fix it is like boiling the ocean. It cannot be done. It cannot just be done. You have to set in place a new infrastructure that will gradually over time clean the data, market forces that value good quality data. And I think that will solve the problem over time. It might take 5 or 10 years, it may take 20 years, but at least it will work. I'll leave it there. I guess in terms of the point, I think what I'm really saying is that there's a lot of change going on at the source level of healthcare data. And so for this body to be focusing on the quality of healthcare data, VHR data and other data that's available today, that's aiming for, that's aiming the puck for where it was yesterday, not for where it's going to be tomorrow.
No, thanks. And I think that this tying together some of the comments that were made, but I think this can fit into some of the scheme we talked about. Some of the challenges we have are essentially, our healthcare system or lack of healthcare system is a disaster. And the fragmentation of care, the sort of discontinuities in the healthcare system as people cross major life transitions, the fact that different actors in the healthcare system think that data is the new oil, when at this point I'd say data really are the new snake oil. Nobody's making any money. Maybe someday data will be the new oil. Right now, data are the new snake oil. But I think there is a belief that, that data are the new oil. Therefore, I will keep mine in the ground where it will do no one any good. So those issues, putting those issues back on the scheme that we started with, those issues really have to do with where patients appear and where their data appears. Do people seek care? Can they get care? Is their care fragmented? Is the data that comes out of their care fragmented? Those are all, for us, those turn into data quality issues. Then there are some of these other issues we're talking about which have to do with in some ways, the clinical aspect of data generation. Do providers recognize things? Do they record them? Then there are some of these downstream issues we're talking about. I'm getting back to this sort of boiling the ocean question. At least what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to segment the ocean at least. I'm at least trying to make some, take some pieces of the ocean to pull them out, to put them in a pond and say, can I at least boil that part? But I think your point that, if we're going to say our goal as people want to improve data quality is to fix the U.S. healthcare system, we will be trying to boil the ocean on that one.
Yeah, just to pick up on a couple of these points too, and it's been a really good discussion. It is true that personal health data or data coming from people has not been a viable business model so far, but there is a lot of continued effort in that regard, and some major administration and announcements yesterday to try to facilitate that direction. So it is coming, and it's part of sort of the NIH initiatives around longitudinal data on patients being a source of advancing the whole precision medicine initiative. It's probably a little ways off for research purposes like we're focusing on here, but definitely worth thinking about. And to Greg's point about, and your point about not boiling the ocean, I mean, we have had a number of suggestions yesterday and some this morning around places to start in terms of some general principles or steps that could be taken to look at potentially any kinds of data. It might be easier or harder to do for some than others. We talked about maybe some priority types of data or types of measures based on data, like major acute cardiac events, where there is a pretty good history and also a lot of examples of real-world evidence studies that would be relevant for regulatory decision-making. So I think the direction I'm taking from this is there are some places to start and build on for moving this field forward, even though it seems like a pretty complex ocean.
I'm realizing I wasn't doing my job here in monitoring comments, so I want to bring up a couple things that came in. Especially for some people, well known to you here yesterday who had to travel back. The point that was made earlier about random misclassification not always leading to so-called conservative bias. Jesse said, probably good to just avoid the use of the term conservative. He wasn't making a political comment. He was making a scientific comment, but the term becomes confusing. So I think, just to be more specific and say, in a superiority design, random misclassification biases toward the null. In a non-inferiority design, it also biases toward the null, but the null leads to a different conclusion. Right. And when you're monitoring safety, it biases toward the null, but the null leads to a different conclusion.
That last point is unbelievably important. A lot of what people want to do here is do comparative studies. Well, a comparative study where one wins, the data quality apparently didn't prevent that from showing up, so you feel all right. If you don't see any difference and the data quality are not good, you're just totally uninformed. And you just have to be conscious of the difference between a trial trying to show a difference and a trial trying not to show a difference. It's overwhelmingly critical on all these matters in relation to data quality and a wide variety of lesions the data might have. It's just, and you mentioned it several times, and there's really nothing more important here.
Yeah, and I'm a couple of things to get in the record. Rich Platt, the point about new data collection going forward prospectively, made the point, really good idea, but not always easy to do. When we go to a large healthcare system and say, all we need for you to do is ask your providers to add a few more clicks to their day, that can be a difficult ask. and Rich's point about, one of his points about transparency, there's sometimes, difficulties in multi-site studies because if we're really interested in transparency about data quality, we want to see site-specific results, because what you may see is that, on average, things look pretty stable. A colleague of Rich's, Chris Liu, has a really nice paper that she published several years ago when we were looking at, the suicide attempt rates across different healthcare systems over time in terms of how those are recorded in the ICD-9 era. And when you average 10 healthcare systems, you got a really a steady rate that was incredibly reassuring. And then when you looked at the 10 different healthcare systems, they were varying by hundreds of % per year. So the average masked an incredible amount of very concerning variation that you got at the site-specific level. That paper, though, was a nice illustration of the fact that we could not get permission from 10 healthcare systems to publish and identify them by their suicide attempt rates. No big surprise there. So we had to do an elaborate sort of masking procedure so nobody would know who they were. So that the site-specific results can be really important for data quality purposes, but sometimes people get sensitive about that. I'm looking, and then Joanne had just these other things we want to make sure to get into the record here. Joanne wanted to underline the point that Jesse made yesterday about expert adjudication. That there is some empirical literature on when did expert adjudication change things and when did it not in the cardiovascular field. That there may not be such an empirical literature in other fields, but we at least want to make sure to highlight that because that, some of that is knowable and it's not just a matter of opinion. And then Joanne had one other point here about, there we go. Just underlining the point about, sort of the transparent chain of following back to the original source data. So I think I've covered those. So I'm thinking, what we probably should do, we've been adding to this document here. We'd like to probably get to, a break time in half an hour. And so we probably want to, wrap ourselves up on this first chunk and maybe get to the second chunk before that time.
Really start on it.
Yeah, to start on that before that time. The question, I guess, I'm not expecting we're producing a checklist here on the spot. But, between, at this point, we're probably somewhere between a checklist and boiling the ocean. But I'd like to think we're not quite at boiling the ocean. We may be at least part way along to, is there some useful guidance? So what I'd like to hear now, as opposed to sort of, comments that add to the list, anybody have any ideas? And these are sort of, we need to take these kind of and digest them. But how would you organize this? Go ahead.
Scott Gordon, FDA. I mean, what's really evolving here is what I hear is the healthcare data that we have now is what it is, except if maybe if there are specific purposes for studies and you add to the, with protocol-driven data collection. So we have an as-is state, and we can either, well, if we wait for that to get better, it's going to take a long time to actually do anything actionable now in terms of secondary use, research, decision-making, public health, et cetera. So at least if we can break this down into the as-is state, how can we use the data as is? If you crack open data from an EHR, that's what it is. We have specific purposes, FDA has purposes, research has purposes, public health has purposes. How can we use it to as best we can? And then the larger question of how can we make the entire ecosystem overall better? It should be driven for the primary purpose of patient and physician, the healthcare ecosystem. But if you improve that system, and the data becomes better inherently by the practice of healthcare and data entry and so on, without overburdening the primary healthcare system, you could have a set of data that is far more usable for secondary use without as much effort. But both have to be done, otherwise we'll be waiting for a very long time to get usable data. So perhaps dealing with just an as-is state, and that becomes something, we've already seen some checklist items, I think. The larger conversation, I think, will not be solved in this room, but I think being part of the larger conversation that is happening all over the place, ONC, public health community, and other forums like this, I think will drive that sort of future state so we can have that whole learning healthcare system that can ultimately make these questions a lot easier.
Frank Sifakis, AstraZeneca. Just to build on that, and I'd like to think that this effort will influence the future state. And I think fundamentally, we all hope that will be the case. And so using, Greg, your framework of, and from comments previously discussed, of different stakeholders requiring different decisions to be made based on data, and acknowledging that fact and sort of boiling it down to what supports these decisions might be a way to organize how the data could be collected or how these decisions should be supported. And I think ultimately, Dr. Califf kind of pointed to a future where data collection would become more routine. It wouldn't be adding to effort or resources, but it would become routine for the purpose of, he mentioned, business decisions, right? So equally important, I think, or more so, would be physicians' decisions about treatment, patients' decisions about options and choices. And so maybe creating that framework from the perspective of the decisions that need to be made by the stakeholders and how that data would be used to support those decisions might be a way to kind of parse it all out.
Let me ask something. In everything FDA has written about use of real-world data, it's made the distinction between trying to do a study with those endpoints and using the data to find patients, maybe consent them, and do a lot of things that would facilitate more conventional kinds of clinical trials. Shouldn't that be part of all this? I mean, for one thing, using the data that way is kind of obvious. Nobody objects to that. And the cost of doing trials at present is staggering. It's hard to find patients. It takes years to find them. If there were a more efficient way to find patients with a particular disease, with some properties that made you want to enroll them, that would be an enormous gain. And we don't want to ignore it because of the dream that we can maybe use these endpoints as part of the trial or an epidemiologic study or something like that. So it seems very critical to get that in there. Moreover, the quality of the data is not as critical. If you mistakenly include someone that you shouldn't have included, you can live with that. That happens all the time. So it's a way to find people. I believe people can be enrolled online as well, and you can find all their enrichment properties. You can do all the things you want to do to get a trial done, and they're all there. Maybe you can train them to be more receptive to being in a trial if you wanted to do that. I mean, that seems like something the VA could easily do. And that whole part needs to be part of this discussion too, because to me, that's the thing where you can obviously use these data. It's much harder to think of them as the study endpoints or doing an epidemiologic study to get an effectiveness conclusion. That's way harder.
You know, I think a very good point, and I would actually, I would see it as a sort of special case, but a really important special case of the more general point that Sebastian was making a while ago about, how you define this phenomenon, broader or looser depends on your purpose. So that, to use your example, if we want to define a myocardial infarction to identify people for a secondary prevention trial who are candidates, we could go loose. If we wanted to define a myocardial infarction as an outcome for the secondary prevention trial, we'd go tight. And what that means is even in the same trial, we might have loose and tight. We might have a different specification for the entry criterion than we have for the outcome. And recognizing that the source data we have would be the same, which is, I'm going back to my point, what I don't want is a database that says there's one definition of myocardial infarction. I want a database that gives me every single, atomic data element and says, here are the atomic data elements. Here's the specification we used for entry, pretty likely myocardial infarction. Here's the specification we used for outcome, highly likely myocardial infarction, and why they're different.
Maybe even imposed by making the people collecting those data investigators.
Yeah.
I mean, you might. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to comment on that and expand it. So Sheila Weiss from Evadera. This kind of work is going on all the time to identify people for clinical trials. There's a lot of companies that offer that as a service to go through observational records. And there's a long history of observational data, and nothing is kind of more in the forefront than the Sentinel and the FDA's use of observational data for safety. And that's usually what we have, right, once something's on the market. Where I think that where we want to talk about and really gear the conversation isn't how we use observational data now, because we really know a lot about it and its strengths and weaknesses and the science and the issues you're talking about, validity, but really pushing it forward or backwards into the development of drugs. In other words, where can observational data be used for proof of efficacy and or effectiveness? Can it be used in what situations to make an approval decision for a drug that's a new indication? That's one. And then pushing it further back for a drug that's never been on the market. Is that, where is that appropriate? And then how about drugs that are on the market? If the company would like to put a comparative claim, for example, a claim of superiority, can you do that with an observational study? Because right now that's against the regulations, right? You need a clinical trial to do that. So where can we now push the envelope?
That's not true. Historically, controlled trials are an acceptable, adequate, and well-controlled study.
For comparative.
If you believed it. But there's no difference. There's no difference between a new claim and a comparative claim. There's nothing in the regs that says there's a different standard.
And how often has it been believed?
Hardly ever.
Thank you.
But I think that point. I think your point, Bob, that needs to be underlined. The question is not about. Somebody's going to ring the bell on me, but the question is not about randomization. The question is about credibility. Yeah.
So I was just going to make a quick comment, just following up on what you said, Greg. That was one of the issues that led to the fact that the Sentinel Common Data Model. I know this is sort of stepping slightly beyond data at one site, but when you're involving distributed sites, and then you want people to conform. You want those data environments to conform to some data model. Obviously, common data models are in common use and are sort of a subset of this discussion. There's various different types of common data models, but your desire, I can't repeat your language exactly, but your desire to basically have maximum flexibility for the analyst and the ability to get down to obviously the codes themselves, not work through a model that imposes predefined algorithms on you, is exactly what FDA was thinking about a long time ago, so that you could do the kinds of things you're saying, have specifications that may be relaxed for inclusion criteria and maybe tighter for outcomes. And just tying it back to one of your other comments, this is where the transparency is absolutely key, so that the reviewers can see what the analyst did, whether it's at a single site with no common data model or whether there's some intervening common data model. So that's just a little footnote to our discussion.
And I was having a discussion with Rich about this yesterday. I say this going back to my very nerdy sort of talk about how diagnoses get generated. I think some things we need to consider is the Sentinel, and PCORNet common data model, which would capture, for instance, all ICD-10 codes. It doesn't capture how that code was generated. Some of that gets into having to negotiate with EHR vendors about allowing people access to that kind of information. But sometimes that kind of information, meaning, if this ICD-10 code was entered with this, back-end diagnostic, because at least in some of these EHR systems I know, an ICD-10 code can be represented by several or sometimes scores of different back-end, in the plumbing diagnostic codes, which actually have different implications for what a provider actually thought. Could you ever get those into the data model? That might be useful. Yeah. Good. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That obviously that was sort of a logistical problem of really being able to get down to that level. I guess an example in a sort of claims-based environment, that there may be all kinds of little things like that going on at numerous EHR environments. But if you have thousands or tens of thousands of them in a giant, claims database, then some of that stuff becomes noise. It's kind of the big data argument, so to speak. So, but yes, there may be other instances where you're doing something on a smaller scale, and we'll need to have progress in that area.
And going back to say, Bob's comment and then Sebastian's comment, earlier about that, if what I'm interested in is identifying people for a trial, the ICD-10 code may be good enough. If I'm interested in an outcome specification, there might actually be times when I feel like I need to go even upstream of that. Yeah.
Yesterday, Mark Wine, VA. Yesterday, the director of the White House Innovation Office, America, at HIMSS, made the point in an announcement that we as a nation in healthcare have to focus on interoperability and get it done. It's dismaying to me that at the VA we called for interoperability with electronic health, with e-health data and information 20 years ago, and we're still today, we've got CMS calling for plug and play. That's what we called for. Mark was part of the leadership, rightfully and well. So the lack of EHR interoperability, whether it's disconnected biomedical research from personal health records, anywhere, anytime, processing for learning and use for wellness and prevention, so that we can get, as a nation, as consumers, to a digital infrastructure for a learning health system where we don't have to have as much health care, but we can have more health. That's where we have to go. And I want to point out 5 barriers that persist to getting to interoperability. Insufficiencies in health data standards. We've had some great discussions. Variation in state privacy rules. Difficulty in accurately matching the right records to the right patients at the right time and right place. There's some great points about situational awareness we've listened to. The costs involved in achieving the goals for usable health records. Yesterday, the announcement from the White House at HIMSS involved changing the meaningful, in ONC, changing the meaningful use definitions and actions. And finally, the need for governance and trust among entities to facilitate sharing health information. Not news, but still persistent barriers and a great goal.
Thanks. One other thing, I'm looking at some, a couple of comments that came in online and reminded me of one thing that did get talked about some yesterday, but I'm not sure got emphasized enough in today's discussion, at least to me, probably needs to be underlined. I can't remember who made the point originally yesterday that, in a lot of other areas, we move to sort of more probabilistic statements about what is true. Traditionally, certainly in clinical trials, we've gone to, dichotomous classifications. A myocardial infarction occurred or it did not. A thromboembolic stroke occurred or it did not. A hemorrhagic stroke occurred or it did not. A suicide attempt occurred or it did not, to use some examples from yesterday. The truth is most of those phenomena truly do have fuzzy boundaries. The actual truth is fuzzy. I'm not just saying our data are fuzzy, I'm saying the actual truth is fuzzy. The boundary between a myocardial infarction and something close to it, I think is fair to say, is not a completely crisp boundary. We certainly could do better if we were to accept sort of probabilistic classification. You know, this is, as somebody was saying yesterday, 0.83 likelihood of being a myocardial infarction. This is 0.92 likelihood, or this is only 0.04 likelihood of being a myocardial infarction. The challenge there is that some of these more sophisticated and more accurate methods are less transparent to people and sometimes cause trouble in our simple brains. You know, so if we imagine that table in a report in the, let's hope it gets into the New England Journal of Medicine, that says, in this group, there were exactly 17.43 myocardial infarctions. And somebody says, how did you come up with something that wasn't an integer? And you say, well, the world is not integers. You know, the world actually can go out to an infinite number of decimal places. And at that point, people would start, the steam would start to come out of their ears. So this is going to be a challenge, you know, the idea that we can be much more sophisticated in use of data to generate more fine-grained classifications, and that's going to have to be balanced against, well, will anybody then even understand what we did? So I'm curious, you know, I'll look at so can you imagine, you know, something coming to, you know, to FDA where somebody is using a probabilistic classification of outcome events and they aren't even integers, and you say, did you adjudicate those events? And we say, yes, a machine learning algorithm adjudicated them very thoroughly and it assigned this one a probability of 0.83.
I think you can imagine that. That's a variant on the usual kind of endpoint. You know, someone would have to work it out and see, but if you win in the usual way, taking into account that endpoints are not unequivocal, I don't think that would be a problem. I haven't seen anybody try to do it. I think you could do it.
I think this has been a great discussion. I do want to be mindful of a couple more great discussions that we need to get in the next less than 2 hours. So this has provided plenty of additional material and perspective for the next steps that we outlined earlier. Bob?
I just want to briefly mention one thing that was discussed a lot yesterday was the possibility of there being multiple attempts to do a study, and you never know about it. It's not like people sign them up for clinicaltrials.gov, but in retrospective things.
The Mulligan problem. We're getting to that one.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you are?
That's
okay,
coming
fine.
on. Yeah. So we'll get to that one. I do want to remind people that a lot of the work that we presented yesterday and the rich discussion yesterday and today is made possible by looking at some specific use cases or leading examples where these steps could be applied, and again, giving some more input on those particular applications would be helpful in our work on finding the place to start and then having a clearer path for expanding out the most effective ways of dealing with these data issues. But thank you all for a great discussion. Any final comments on?
I think you're right. We need to.
Yeah.